I can see we've got 12 people already gathering to hear me talk about a tale for startups. I'm quite happy to monitor Slack conference room 3 while I'm giving the presentation. So if you want to clap or laugh or do anything, show some reaction, just use, emojis in Slack. That would be great. Normally I rely on people having some reaction while I'm giving this presentation and having a laugh or gasp or shocked by what I'm saying. So any feedback, emojis or little messages, I'll happily take them and comment on them because it makes it much more interesting, I think, for me, if not you. Hopefully it'll make it more interesting for you as well. It's not easy, all this online stuff, I do realise that. But I'm hoping it'll be good fun. I'm hoping you all had a nice lunch, maybe, or maybe it was breakfast, or maybe it was supper in the evening. It all depends on where you are in the world. I'm definitely missing out on the ability to add a few kilos at the NDC food booths, but not losing a load of krona by going to the pub and ordering a round of beers. It is quite weird. So I think I've been going to NDC Oslo for about 9 years, and it's a bit odd not being there in person this year. I will no longer get my fix of there being no night time and just this kind of light dusk and in the morning at 2 in the morning, staggering out of a pub and thinking, oh my God, it's not dark yet, which is always a dangerous thing for a British person because we need the light to go dark and cold so we know when we're meant to leave the pub in the evening. So, not that we're allowed to go to pubs at the moment. So it's getting near time to start. So I wish I could do hold music, but I can't hold a tune to save my life. I've happily got a little mascot sat on top of my webcam because it's the way to do a webcam apparently is to look at the eyes on the webcam so that I look like I'm looking at you. I will glance away at my slides every now and then, so apologies if I seem to be ignoring you. I'm not looking at my WhatsApp. Okay, it's 12:40 and welcome to Room 3, NDC Oslo, the first afternoon on the first day. So, I'm Liam Westley. I'm head of engineering at a startup called Free Market FX. We are a fintech startup in London that deals with FX currencies and the ability for small and medium companies to trade FX currency. We're very fortunate that we're in a market where we haven't been affected by the UK lockdown. We haven't had to make anyone redundant or furlough people. And we've actually employed new people while we've been in lockdown. So it's quite a different experience to quite a few companies. So it's a nice startup to be at this time of life. This isn't going to cover that startup, but it's going to cover the 4 startups I've had in my life. I suddenly realized that I've had experience in startups and I've had quite a set of startups over my time since 2001. So that's nearly 20 years worth of experience, different ways of startups and how they work. I was actually struggling to work out how I could convey the time passing apart from showing pictures of me getting much older, which would involve me having long hair, fat, getting thin, having short hair, all sorts of things. I could have done music or films, but cultural things don't always transfer very well. So instead, I decided that a way of showing you how time has moved on and how things have changed is what mobile phone I was using when I was working at that company. So the first startup I'm going to talk about is a startup called Smashed Atom. And there I was using a Nokia 8310, a tiny little phone. It was the point at which you went to the smallest phones in the world that you could possibly have, and it fitted in your shirt pocket, and it lasted for days on one charge, but then it didn't do a lot. It did phones and it did SMSs. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I will just remove that reminder for a meeting. So yes, I was using this tiny little, thank you, Mikhail, this tiny little phone. If you wanted to do data connection, it used infrared to go between the laptop and the phone. It was quite bizarre. So yes, That was my life at that point on the phone world. So what was this company? So the important thing about startups is how they were formed, and they all four that I've worked out were formed in quite different ways. So Flextech itself used to be Flextech was a big TV arm of a cable company in the UK, and it had a division called Flextech Interactive that did interactive TV applications and back-end services for cable TV. They joined with a company called Atomic Tangerine, hence the orange color of the smashed atom logo and the word atom in our brand name. And they were a VC arm of Stanford Research Institute. So half of the employees came from this cable TV company. And then there were some shares left over for employees, but most of them were owned by the TV company and the VCs. Interactive television was a big thing. This is 2001. Phones didn't do data, not proper data. There weren't smartphones. It was going to be years before we got really decent data rates on mobile phones, and 3G would allow people to use them properly. And a lot of people didn't have broadband. It was dial-up modems everywhere. So most people at home didn't have a computer that they could connect to the internet. So these cable TV boxes could act as a mini computer, really. They had kind of either cable TV had Netscape 2 as a interface, effectively, a cut down version of Netscape. And that was there for controlling the box. Sky went a different system, which was a combination of a kind of hack between C and Java running on the set-top box. And that's how people were going to interacting with the internet. So when they saw a TV program, they could press a red button and then they could look at extra footage. It was almost like having, you know, the DVD extras you get on a film. It was almost like that, but on your television at home, and it was all accessible. So it's really cool kind of industry. And the reason I got involved in this is I'd worked at B-Sky-B. So I'd been at B-Sky-B for 7 years or so as a contractor, and then actually as a permanent. And we used to do graphics for TV, for elections and for weather and for football. And then we got involved in the first interactive TV applications at Sky, where you could watch the football, and if you press the button, you could see different camera angles at the football pitch, and you could see the stats of how much time Arsenal were in the Tottenham half and how many goals Tottenham had managed to score, how many attempts at goal that Tottenham had scored against Arsenal and things like that. So we'd done all this work, and B-Sky-B was a really kind of it was the underdog of the TV industry at that point. Obviously, it's now huge. Sky News, Sky Italia, Sky Deutschland, they're worth billions. They've been bought by a US company, and they're no longer part of Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. But at that point, they were an underdog, and they were really fighting their corner. So it's almost like being a startup, but it was bigger than a startup, and it was, no one would have considered it a startup at the time. But we were doing interactive TV there. So I went and got poached by this company, and they said, I think you can have more fun doing this job, and we're starting up, and we're going to do interactive TV as a company and provide services. And it sounded really interesting, and Sky was starting to get layers of management, layers of structure. You no longer could just go to the head of Sky News and have a chat about how we were going to do an election. There was a project manager and a producer, and you weren't allowed to talk to people directly anymore. And the head of Sky News no longer was on the minibus from the tube station to the office, and he no longer, if you bumped into the head of Sky News in the gents, he wouldn't have a chat with you like the Aussies, because he'd become British. The head of Sky News, the original Australian head of Sky News, used to have a chat to you while you were trying to go to the toilet, which for a British person is really uncomfortable, and for Australians probably quite normal. I don't know. I haven't really tried to go to the toilet in Australia and have a chat with people. It might feel a bit weird. So I decided it was time to leave, and I got headhunted, as I said, and it was quite interesting because you've got these startup credentials. So what is a startup? What does it really benefit? I was trying to think, how do I describe, the next aspect of a startup? Well, how did it start? What makes it a startup? Well, one thing was VC funding from the US. They had proper VC funding. It had people who were speculatively investing in the company, hoping that it was one of maybe 8-10 companies they invested in that wasn't going to go bust, because that's what VC funding definitely was at that point. It throw money at the wall and see what sticks, and you expected loads of them not to work out. It works very much like the movie industry. Only 1 in 10 films actually makes money back, but that's the one that pays for the other 9. But we were in the final wave of the dot-com boom, so we'd already had the stock market go absolutely berserk. We'd had companies like QXL, an auction site in the UK, had gone really high and just been bought by a German auction company. Loads of new startups. I suspect in the UK we still had Friends Reunited at that point. That was a rival to MySpace and Facebook before it got wiped out by those monolith. Well, that's behemoths, huge industrial powers that we now have in the internet era. The interesting bit is because we had VC funding from the US, we were taught by lawyers how to write patents or patents, depending on US or UK pronunciation. And that was quite interesting as well. So there was a regarding of the worth is not just the software, but it's also the things you might do, your patent software. To be honest, if I really heart in heart, I don't think you should patent software personally. I think it's the wrong thing to do. The idea that it's completely novel anymore to patent any bit of software, it makes me sound like a complete open source guy. I'm not completely that. I think people need to make money from software. Most open source companies eventually struggle to make money from software. And you look at Docker and you look at GitHub, and they've had to be kind of funded and supported by really big companies that do charge money. So it's not an easy path, but I don't think software patents are really a valid thing. Things like patenting how video is encoded, I can see the point, and that's quite a different thing because that's quite a technological thing. But some of the software patents are so trivial it should never have been allowed. And the other thing about startup credentials is because they came from this company called Flextech Interactive, they knew who were half the people in the company, so they went and printed mugs with everyone's name on it. So everyone had a mug with their name who'd started the company when it started. So I got given this mug with New Boy written on. Any of the new people got these. Why did you take a photo of them? 19 years ago. I didn't. I took them before I made this presentation about 6 months ago, and that's because I managed to buy them for 50p each at the end when the company actually ceased to exist, when they were just selling everything off and giving the money to charity. The other thing that was a startup credential was the fact that I got given the title broadcast architect, which I don't think ever existed as a concept. I talked to them about what I was going to do, and they were kind of described what I was going to do. And when I arrived, I said, what projects am I going to work on? And they said, well, we haven't really got any projects for you to work on at the moment, but we think we ought to have people like you, so we decided to employ you. So this was a company that had VC funding, a pile of cash, and said, we ought to employ people to prove that we're using this cash to good effect, while not necessarily having the business plan to have income to cover the salaries of those staff. So that was a bit of a shame. Bit worrying at the start. Why wasn't it a startup though? There is little things that made it not quite a startup in my head. The chief executive and managing director, which effectively is CEO and COO in American terms, they came from Logica, which was a kind of consultancy services company, quite a huge consultancy that had a Logica process and a Logica methodology. So they weren't used to Agile. And big telcos aren't used to Agile, so it was quite a good fit when they were doing big projects in cable TV companies. And although B-Sky was big, it had this startup underdog mentality that I'd come from. So I was more used to a more kind of freewheeling way of working. So they did things that were quite weird. They employed a knowledge officer in a company of 60 people with an open plan office and only 2 meeting rooms because they thought people might not talk to each other and share information about the company, but we could, because we could just walk to each other's desks. It wasn't that hard. And we had project managers even for small projects. So you'd be talking to a customer, maybe the BBC, and say, we ought to do this pilot app and just do a demo of how we might do it. So I just need a designer and 1 programmer, and we can design all this and get it done in a week. And when you talk to the project manager, he says, no, you probably need a UX expert, a designer. I've got to project manage it. We've got to have budgets. And the whole project ballooned into this 3 weeks instead of like 4 days to do a sample demo application. And it became unfeasible even to just write a little demo application. And you just thought the writing's on the wall here. And also we had timesheets. We actually were recording every hour we were spending during the day and which customer we were working for so that they could bill accurately. And that was a weird thing because I'd never experienced that at Sky. Sky had just said, well, you're a central resource that Sky News and Sky Sport and everyone can use. We just fund it out of the graphic design budget for the whole of the company, and what they need you give them, and if you need more money for equipment and stuff, the channels will pay for it if it's hardware, and they'll probably pay a little bit more to do overtime, to do projects, but it was a centrally allocated budget. So in this timesheet world, because obviously I wasn't working too hard because they hadn't really got a job for me in a way, they realized that there were people who weren't working, and if you're not working, that's a bit of a waste. So if there's a project going on and you aren't allocated to it, but you haven't got any other work, maybe you could work on that project. And that's a good idea, right? So, but then the human mentality came in and they gamed the system. So project managers and product managers would actually not include things like an architect on a project so that you were left idle so they could then bring you in at zero cost later on in the project. And it was just a fascinating insight into human behavior at that point. And that really isn't a startup idea. That isn't really how startups are meant to work. Benefits, at this time, even in the big .com companies, you didn't get free food and kind of bendy slides going between the floors or comfy beds at work and things like that. So we were actually quite lucky. We got pension and life assurance, which is an unusual thing to get actually, because the reason they had to do that was these guys, half the company had come from this big cable TV company, and they had pensions and life assurance, and they weren't going to go to this startup without having the kind of similar thing. And there's a legal rules in the UK that said you have to transfer terms and conditions of employment, so they carried that with them. We also got share options. We got discussed about them. We got drafts provided, but they never got implemented. Now, the point is, yeah, they never got implemented, and that's because we didn't last long enough. Let's be honest. If you think that page is left intentionally blank, you ought to see one later. So the other thing I realized when I was going to have to discuss startups is I really need to discuss crazy shit. And now crazy shit happens in big companies in a way, but it's kind of monolithic and it's kind of almost over the top. But crazy shit happens in startups all the time. People have mad ideas and there aren't many people. And if they're important enough, they'll just get away with it. So the head of design really wanted us to have a kind of on-brand message. So everything was the right Pantone color, our fonts were this size, they had this spacing. And it's a really important thing, actually, to be honest, to make sure that the company branding is accurate and on message. And it's good when you're doing applications for customers. The interesting bit was we had pillars holding up the ceiling, as most modern buildings do. And they were painted this orange Pantone color, and it all looked brilliant for about a week until the paint dried out, and she decided it was not quite the right orange. And so for a cost of about £10,000, we all had to move all our desks again, get the painters back in, repaint all the columns so that when the paint dried out, it was actually the right Pantone color. And I swear there was a fish tank in the office, and I thought she was about to get the fish out of the fish tank and make sure they were the correct Pantone color and paint them as well. So the other thing that I saw is I'd spent years at B-Sky-B working on interactive TV applications, 2-3 years, and I was used to how hard they are. It's like programming a washing machine. There is hardly any memory, the graphics are very poor, the performance of the box isn't very good. And that may sound really weird, and why on earth would you do that? Well, if my set-top box costs me an extra $50 to manufacture so that we can have super graphics and a faster video rendering and more flexibility in how we do applications, and we've got 5 million of those set-top boxes, I've just spent 250 million extra pounds. That kind of money, that's quite a lot of money to spend just so that your applications are about 1 second more snappy or have more colors than 64,000 colors in a 24-bit. So people don't do that, but yet I was watching a demo written in Macromedia Director. Macromedia were the guys who created Flash before Adobe bought the company, and it was like a video editing program. And these applications look fantastic. These set-top boxes could do stuff that even a laptop at the time would struggle to do live. But it was okay because this was rendered, so it all worked beautifully. And I was just scared witless that they didn't understand the problem they were really dealing with. And then the last thing we were doing before the end came, we were working on a big project for British Telecom. So that's like, I think Nortel is your telecom company in Norway, or Telefonica in Spain, something like that. And they wanted to roll out video on demand. This was 2001. They were going to roll out effectively Netflix to the home. They were planning to put in a complete backbone network in the UK. They wanted regional data centers. They wanted lots of video servers. They wanted the ability to do multicast video so that you didn't even need a satellite dish or an aerial on your roof. They could multicast a live TV program to everyone's home. This was a request for proposal that, when it was printed, was over a meter high on a desk. We were only one little subset of that, which was to do with the television service and the data services via television. It was called Project Simon because the aim was to make it simple, which was a laughable thing when you saw how detailed the proposal was and how it would cost 10 to 20 billion pounds to create the entire network. And we were just being allowed to make up how we were going to get EPG data, the program data, so that you knew what was coming up and what was now next. And some of it was based on standards, and some of it we were just frankly making up because we just had to do it. So that was really weird to be in that situation. But the end came. I've hinted that we only lasted, I think, 9 months. I managed to work for that company. No, 7 months for that company. The interesting one was we worked in the centre of London. If anyone's been to London, we tend to have a pub drinking culture. It's one of those things that people have. It's really antisocial for people who don't drink, I have to say. It's not, I've realized how antisocial it becomes to some people. But at that point, everyone went down the pub on a Friday night, Marquis of Granby, just around the corner in Fitzrovia, off Oxford Street near Tottenham Court Road. And one night we were there, it was towards the end of August. The financial controller for the company had 2 big bags of shopping, and we kind of looked at her, and there were these 2 huge bags that she was carrying out, and was stood at the pub with them at her feet. And we said, "Oh, you're going away for the weekend? Have you bought a load of stuff?" And she goes, "No, I just needed a few things from my desk." And basically, she'd actually emptied her desk that Friday night because she thought there wasn't enough money in the company so that the doors would be locked on us on the Monday. So one piece of advice I would always say to you, that if your financial controller or your chief of finance takes all the stuff off their desk and goes home with it one day, you ought to do the same, because you don't know what's happening to the company at that point. So that was a bit weird. And then we found out the reality of it the next week. We actually had this situation. Now, this is an interesting, this happened a lot in the dot-com boom, or dot-com bust. And there's a company called boo.com who had a kind of book written about it, an e-commerce fashion company. And they certainly did this. We had room A and room B. And we were asked to, one day, a load of us went into room A and a load of us went into room B. And I was in the room A people. And the management were in there, and they told us, "Please, can you leave the building for 3 hours? Please don't come back. Whatever you do, don't come back in the next 3 hours." And we thought, this is terrible. We're being sacked. We were very mistaken. We were the people being kept on. Anyone who was in room B was fired at that point, told to clear their desks and leave the building within the next 3 hours, so that when we came back, half the company had disappeared. And that's quite a scary thing to experience. And it allows HR apparently to deal with everyone in one go. I think the scary bit in the modern era is that people are having this happen to them on Zoom and on Microsoft Teams. It's horrible. Must be absolutely horrible to have this happen to you. It was pretty bad when it was in person. So we were fairly miserable, and we were trying to get over it and be bought by another company. And then we wandered down to the pub, this time the Bricklayers Arms, which is a very nice pub, tiny little pub. And the phones went. someone's phone went. Minutes later, another person's phone went. My phone went. We all answered the phones, and then we heard that this plane had gone into the Twin Towers in New York, and that was September the 11th, 2001, 9/11, and that's when we knew it was really over. So that was it. The company was going to fold. There was never going to be a rescue for us, and we were just looking at, right, this is the end of it. If you now try and look up about Smashed Atom, you'll find one article in the Guardian newspaper in the UK. I don't know how the Guardian got to hear about it. Maybe an employee, maybe, used a different email address and covered their tracks so it wasn't found out how it got leaked. Maybe, but they'd have to be quite a sensible, maybe broadcast architect to get away with that. So the legacy of that company was, when the company ended really suddenly, people kept in touch, you know, and this is really cool. Because when people leave a company slowly and it doesn't kind of implode or explode, depending on your view of what happened, you actually find that, that people keep in touch. And we had a group where everyone talked to each other. And a senior network engineer recommended me for an ex-startup at B-Sky-B, and a head of development brought me in to Cello Media, where he was head of development a few years later. So personal legacy for me was I broke away from B-Sky-B, which was becoming management heavy. I got a taste of a startup culture and I quite liked it. I quite liked that vibe of uncertainty and weirdness and crazy shit. I'd also started cycling all the way to work in central London. So I was cycling 15, 20K a day. Oh, in and then 20K back. Few bumps on the road, you know, cars. There was much less cycle lanes. It was massively more dangerous, frankly, at that point. And I didn't wear a helmet, which was the most stupid thing in the world. And because I was in central London, I could attend meetups and go to user groups. And that was really cool as well, because I don't think I would have gone all the way from outside of London and spend an hour going on the tube to go to a meetup and see if it was worth going to, and then spend an hour getting home. But it was very easy to just walk out of the office and go down. But as I said, the company went bust. Some people were very upset. I was sanguine about it. I knew that this would happen. I had enough money in the bank that I could survive it, and we were paid off for proper redundancy, which was unusual for a startup, and that was done because the embarrassment of the cable company would have been so huge had they not done that. And I already had this idea. I had this idea that a friend or colleague who I'd worked with at GMTV, a breakfast TV company in the UK, he ran an IT services arm. He put in networking servers, made computers work. He did all the support. So he was sysops, system engineer. And he had a company called Deus Ex Machina, which stands for God Outside the Machine. And he'd been running that for years. And he really wanted to do software, and he'd talked to me about it on numerous occasions. So we formed a new company, Original Thinking Group. Phones didn't move on much in those days, so I was still Nokia 8310. So this was 2.5 years we formed this group. So it was post-Smashed Atom. I chatted with the guy. We worked out, right, if I merged the assets from my company, which was Tiger Computer Services Limited, and with the business experience of DEM, we could create a software side. We could reuse their offices, which were just above a McDonald's on Oxford Street, 10 minutes away from the office I'd just been working in for Smashed Atom. And there was enough cash that the founder of DEM and the major shareholder could actually fund that software company for quite a while. And I would just merge my assets in. So my investment in the company was, I will provide about 10 to 15,000 pounds worth of assets, an MSDN subscription, servers, desktops, laptops, all that kind of thing, even a printer, I think. And then also, I would take a cut in salary. I would go from £60,000 a year to £30,000 a year and be able to live on that, so I wasn't too bothered. The incentive for me to do all this was the fact that if we managed to, I started with 10 or 15%, I can't remember which, and I was getting more and more shares as the company did better and financially better. So I was incentivized to make the company make money. And I would eventually get to a 25% shareholding, which is a magic number in terms of owning shares in a company in the UK, because it allows you to veto the other shareholder from doing things. You get to become a majority shareholder up to 24%. The other people who own the company can just do whatever they like and you can't stop them. We shared accountancy services in the office. which was really nice because it was a glass meeting room with glass walls, and it was really good to bring clients in because it looked very impressive for what was a very young company. Took on a junior programmer from the IT services company, but he really just did VB script. He wasn't really in his heart a software developer. In his heart, he was a cricketer and rugby player at the weekend who used to come in injured on a Monday. Or if you were lucky, or you'd come in on Tuesday or Wednesday with a fractured wrist and all sorts of things. But eventually I employed a guy from BSkyB instead to replace him. And the other thing is it took us, weird things happen in startups, it took us 4 days to get the name Original Thinking Group. And we were really struggling. And when we worked out that we wanted to call it that, we found out that to have the word group in your name, you had to have 3 companies that had a shareholding that was similar. So we had DEM, we had Original Thinking Group, and we had to register another company. And we registered, and it's still there in Companies House in the UK, there is a company called PLBCK Limited, which obviously stands for Problem Lies Between Chair and Keyboard. And that was the company we just created to get the word group in our name. Benefits, none. I mean none. No pension, no life insurance, half the salary, probably working 50, 60 hours a week instead of working a normal 40 hours a week. So it was a very interesting time. It was fun, but it was hard work. And someone's just checked on Companies House. And and we didn't even have a shower or something for actually when I cycled into work. So I had to join a gym just to be able to have a shower. But it was good fun. We had existing TV companies that DM worked for, Hat-Trick Productions, who do things like Outnumbered, Have I Got News for You, Tiger Aspect, who made drama and comedy and were behind Peaky Blinders recently. And equally, there was a startup who was a community forum on cable who were working on a SMS to screen service for BSkyB. And they'd gone and hired the Smashed Atom network engineer. They brought me in to do the work on creating a moderation system and getting a system that could deliver the SMS messages to set-top boxes. And we were negotiating a share of income from the SMS messages so that we would be paid for how busy the service was. And this is where I realized how good it was to have someone experienced in business and contracts, because my business partner was not convinced. And it's not the first time, by the way, in a startup I've seen a spreadsheet that had fanciful projections, or optimistic projections is more what the project manager would normally say, that suggested there were going to be millions of messages and there would be lots of money flowing, and therefore we were going to get very rich by just getting 1/10 of 1 pence of every message. And we were going, okay, we get 1/10 of a penny per message. There's millions of messages. This is worth quite a lot. And they said, yes, you're going to be earning at least 600,000 a year off this, and it's worth doing this. And you're not going to get paid properly to write it. You're going to get paid as a kind of revenue share. And we said, well, we'll put a minimum in that, shall we? And they said, well, you don't need a minimum. It's guaranteed this is going to work really well. But my business partner was quite keen on a minimum. So he put the minimum in about 1/3 the estimate of what we were going to earn. And doing that meant we had to send our source code to a lawyer. So I got to find out what escrow was, how a lawyer could keep your source code in their safe available, and you had to update it regularly, and we had to pay for that lawyer to be able to do this. So that if we went bankrupt, Media could own the code, which is a reasonable protection for a partner that you're working with. And this is not an uncommon thing to do in the industry. The business realities, which is the crazy shit, is we had that minimum guarantees, but Sky decided we weren't going to use SMS to do messages. We were going to use the built-in application and use the remote control. And it had the remote control had the letters on it like you had on old phones. And it didn't have T9. So it took ages to type a message on that set-top box. You could buy a keyboard, but the only people who seemed to buy the keyboards for the set-top box were developers of applications who said how great it was to have a keyboard, but no one at home spent £30 having a keyboard to talk to their set-top box. So this meant the services were much less popular. They were every day on Sky News. They were also on Sky One events and on some live sport, but the shortfall was massive. We had nothing like the throughput of messages that we were meant to get. So Media realized this and said, this is really bad. we needed BSkyB as a big client, so that's why we want to get the contract, but we don't really want to pay this money out on this minimum guarantee. And they knew that every time we gave them an invoice, we had to pay VAT on it. So if we gave them an invoice for £50,000, we had to pay the government £10,000 on top for the VAT. So they tried to not pay invoices so that we would go bankrupt by having to pay the VAT tax bills to the government and pay the employees' wages and the overheads of having an office and all sorts of things like that. And they were trying to trigger the clause to provide the source code. So we were actually being forced to go bankrupt in order to get hold of the source code for our software and avoid paying the 200,000. The really good news was that my business partner had loads of money in the bank and carried on regardless and just kept the money flowing until we got lawyers involved and got them to pay the money. And in the end of it, in the year that Sky had the service, we got approximately £250,000 for providing that service from UMedia, who probably got no more than £10,000 to £20,000 back from the actual messages and contracts from Sky. And the amazing bit was we wondered how we'd managed to get away with this, even though it seemed, it was good negotiation by my business partner. It was very odd that they agreed to this. And we later discovered that while we were having this phone call negotiating the final contract on a Friday night, and we talked to them at 7, and then they went off the phone. Then they talked to us at 8, and they went off the phone. Then they talked to us at 8:30. And in between all these phone calls, they were talking to Sky, and Sky had insisted that both myself and the network engineer were named personnel on the contract, and that's why they were forced to actually take on that liability of paying us that much money. Close down of the company. There was a recession in the TV industry. 9/11 left such a wake in its path. The TV industry relies on advertising. There wasn't much advertising. The dot-com boom had happened. There was a whole recession caused by the world being paranoid about terrorism for quite many years, and then having what could be considered stupid wars. So it's hard to find regular income, but we had money in the bank. So we actually decided maybe we should just wind this company up, take the money, be happy that we haven't ended up out of pocket. It was a nice experience. We enjoyed working on stuff. The interesting bit was the worry I had was I had to make the only employee I had redundant. So I took him into this glass-walled office meeting room and talked to him and said, I need to talk to you seriously about something. I was worried because, he's got to pay his bills. He's got to pay his rent. I was worried about his future and disappointing him. And he said, before you start, I need to tell you something. I'm going to resign because I want to go for 2 months cycling in New Zealand and the US. And we left that office smiling and laughing. My business partner couldn't understand why the hell we weren't both terribly upset, because we both looked upset going in and we both came out smiling and laughing. Told him what had happened and we went down the pub. And it was really nice to have such a pleasant ending to a company where everyone was happy that it was over. It was the right time to leave and no one was out of pocket. And that was really cool. And I was quite keen to finish anyway, because to some extent I was having a kid. So I knew there was a kid coming in December. This was probably about October, November time. So I had some time off to get ready for the kid coming. And the legacy of this is I came to the realization how hard it is to employ people. Employing people is not a minor thing. You're responsible for them in a very, very real way. Now, if you own a company with employees, you get paid last or not at all. And I learned about how to do contract negotiation. I kind of learned how to read a profit and loss sheet, but I've kind of left some of that behind, I think. And the other one is I got used to CapEx and OpEx and how businesses work and how you can actually prove it's worth doing a project. So it became useful later on running software teams and running developments to go, no, we need to use this new thing. This new thing costs a load of money, but it will save us this money. And within 6 months, we'll make it all back. And quite often that argument works very well. It doesn't always work. People get stuck and will happily allow people to sit there doing useless tasks rather than buy some software in. But it actually does allow you to make that argument more forcefully. But after that startup, I went into what I could call the wilderness years. If you want, I became a consultant and a contractor. I went back to running my company. I delivered a system, QVC, doing the same kind of moderation system that we'd sold to Sky via UMedia. It took 2.5 years of sales lead chasing for me to get that deal. After 2.5 years, they started a pilot. They paid me £600 a month for having a pilot moderation system. They ran that system for 6.5 years before they finally took it in-house. And that paid for all the overheads of my company, a rented office, all the accountancy bills, all the MSDN subscriptions. And it was a really great way of running a company. I also worked for Cello Media with the ex-head of Smashed Atom, helped launch a live shopping channel in the Netherlands. And I also got contacts from the .NET user group that allowed me to get other work. During that time, I started moving to Windows mobile phones. The weirdest one being the bottom one in the bottom right that looks like it's hit by an ugly stick. That is actually called the Lobster phone, Virgin Lobster. It had a DAB radio inside it, which is why they needed to put a bulge on the side because it held all the electronics for the DAB radio. And they even broadcast TV down a DAB radio signal. It's really weird. Never caught on, it has to be said. And I can still turn it on and get a DAB signal. Very bizarre. But the legacy of all that was I didn't have a pension. I paid my own life insurance. So people who have kids, if you haven't got life insurance from the company, you buy a life insurance policy. So you say for the next 18 years, I'm going to pay so much per month. And then if I pass on, there's money to help my other half and the kids survive the fact that I'm not going to be around. These are the kind of conversations where you have with your partner and you say, we've got a mortgage that's got payment protection. I've got this life assurance and we're now at the maximum amount that we owe in money and the maximum amount of money that you could get. This is the point at which you should push me off the edge of a cliff, because from this day onwards, I'm worth less and less financially to you as we pay off all our debts. But it's a loving moment when you have that conversation with your other half, and then you check whether the knife drawer is being used. I was free to set my own hours while my kids were young. So my other half did 12-hour shifts overnight, 12-hour shifts during the day, and it allowed me to do all that. And I had more time to talk at user groups and developer conferences. Ian Cooper forced me to talk at the user group, got me to talk at developer conferences. That has ended up with me talking at NDC. It also allowed me to become Microsoft MVP, and I ended up working with Ian Cooper in the end. So it was really good part of my life. The only problem we had was I worked in a shared office where everyone was self-employed, and at 2 PM in summer when it was nice weather, we'd just go, hey, it's about time for a beer, isn't it? We all went down the pub, and eventually my other half said, you could work properly and earn more money. And I kind of went, yes, rather than having a nice easy life and going down the pub 2 times a week in summer and frittering my money away. And she decided she'd like to actually enjoy the kids too and help raise them a bit more and see them more. So we switched roles, and I became the person who had to get a proper job. And she went to get a very interesting proper job, but not as well paid, teaching babies how to swim. And at this point, I found a startup via an alt.net beers conference in London. I joined a company called IMC Group, and obviously because it's a startup, it changed its name within years to Criteria MX, Criteria Media Exchange. They're an MP3 download group. By now, by the way, I'd gone to the zenith of what a Microsoft mobile candy phone was, and it was really good. But I'd started to use Android phones because the £100 Android phones had come in, and they were now really quite powerful and quite interesting to use and good to play with. So that's where we come to, the start of Android taking over. This was privately funded by high net worth individuals, which means angel investors, basically. It was started by a guy called Alan Callan. He used to help run a record label started by Led Zeppelin. He'd worked at Warner Music. It had really weird structure. There were bits of it owned in Monaco, bits of it in Luxembourg, bits of it in the Isle of Man, possibly something in Jersey, who knew? Alan was a man who lived well beyond his time. He had terminal bone cancer and managed to exceed the 2 years that the doctors had given him and live for another 7 or 8 years. He was mad as a bag of frogs, but that's kind of media types for you who've worked in the industry. Startup credentials for this company. Immediately I moved into an office in Chiswick. We moved 1 week later to another office, serviced office in Hammersmith. I remember the CTO interviewing me. He had a broken leg. It was propped up on the desk because he'd had a snowboarding accident. The head of development of the software guy, the development team, had seen me talk at a developer conference and said, you were really good. I really enjoyed that talk, at which point I realized that I just had to not say something stupid and I would get this job. And it was the first time I'd worked with a proper agile crew. We had 2-week sprints, retrospectives, an agile Zen board, Jira, build servers. I'd been doing TDD, but this was proper TDD, so that it really, you didn't get, unless the test passed, the build would fail and you wouldn't use it. We only had about 50% full-time employees, mostly contractors. We did the standard startup thing of renaming the company, pivoting on what we were doing. One of the advantages of renaming a company is suddenly you're eligible for BizSpark because you have to be a new company with a certain level of income. So we managed to get huge numbers of MSDN licenses and services for free, which is quite cool. Our client base, these were the big record companies. So we had Warner Music, EMI, and Sony on board. That meant we had 100 terabytes of disk storage in a kind of cupboard in the office, in a serviced office in Hammersmith. That 100 terabytes contained all the uncompressed, non-copy protected music that Warner Music, EMI, and Sony had in their back catalogue. It was frightening to think how much valuable assets we had sat in a room with a portable air conditioner. So in summer, the window had to be opened and a little hose dragged out of the window to keep it cool enough so it didn't switch off. We white labeled for the Daily Telegraph and Royal Opera House. And it eventually became clear that the real value of the company was the contracts with the record companies, not that we were actually making any sales. Benefits, we had no pension. We talked about share options, never got that done. Had to argue paternity leave to be paid for someone. The finance officer said dads don't really always want to actually be with their kids after they're born. And I pointed out he might not have in the 60s, but I think a modern dad wants to actually see their kid when they're new. So, and help their wife out, you know. Going full time allowed me to use my contract negotiation skills I'd learned at Original TG. And I managed to negotiate half day Wednesday, leaving at 2 in the afternoon to pick up the kids from school and take them swimming and take them to Cubs and Scout groups. And I got 10 days annual allowance to talk at user groups and conferences, which was really cool. And the Microsoft MVP award helped me with that because that was a valuable asset to the company in order to have its credentials for investors and customers we were going to work with. Crazy shit we had, wandering around these Luxembourg data centers. So sat on the top of buildings in Luxembourg, as they point out, that way is France, that way is Germany, that way is Luxembourg, and they're all a few miles away. And they're going, that electricity comes from France, that electricity comes from Germany, that's our redundancy. I looked at diesel generators at the bottom of these buildings, and we talked about, but what happened if there was a complete freak weather thing? Who gets the diesel if the airport's closed? And they said, well, the diesel, first place the diesel goes to is the army and the airports to keep them running. And he said, and then the next place it comes is to us at the data centers. So we're second in line or third in line after the army and the airports. And he said, what about the hospitals? And they said, no, it's more important to keep a data center open than it is to keep a hospital running, which gives you an idea of how Luxembourg viewed the world, because at the time they had Skype and Amazon and eBay and everyone based in their data centers, and they thought they were strategically more important than hospitals. Interesting. We also got asked to do a charity site after the 2011 tsunami. So we actually had Alan request that can we launch in a week something that could sell music to the Japanese public to raise funds. We had no one who actually could speak Japanese. We had no payment provider who could accept yen, and we had no permission to sell music in that country. And I actually had a folder in my email box called Crazy Shit Alan's Asked For, and that went straight in it. We even had our salaries late by about a week once because the money was bouncing between different bank accounts from Luxembourg to the Isle of Man with various routes. And it went through Dubai, and Dubai thought we were money laundering. And I tell you now, if Dubai thinks you're money laundering, you're in trouble. But the legacy of this was I had my agile practices reinforced. I really understood about CI build service, TDD, Kanban. I learned how to negotiate an employment contract, which is really cool because I used that at Huddle the next time on the next startup. I managed to get the same scenario where I worked 4.5 days a week and got half a day off to pick up the kids from school at least once a week and take them swimming and do the Cubs and things like that. I also worked out how to deal with management and influence the future of the company. I did manage to get the CTO, the second CTO removed effectively, but it was a week later than I'd accepted a job offer from Huddle. So, but yes, so I left the with a load of knowledge and a load of experience and brought it to Huddle. Now, Huddle was a real proper startup. This was a darling of the UK startup scene. When I joined at Huddle, I was still running Android phones, but very soon the Lumia 520 came out and gave you a Windows Mobile that was cheap enough. And then for some reason, I stuck with Windows Mobile up until last year when I finally bent and said, sod it, I'm getting a Samsung Galaxy. So Huddle was formed in 2006. It really was VC funded properly, like an American proper startup. Eden Ventures and Matrix Partners had put money in. They're big names in the VC funding. It had 4 funding rounds, approximately 90 million invested in the company. I joined after the C funding round. I think I was the last person in before there was a crunch on income. Every time you get funding in VC, it's like a sine wave like this. You get more money, you employ more people, you don't get the sales, you have to let a few people go, then you employ more people. And it's like this kind of wave of employment and money and cash flow. So we finally got sold to private equity firm Turn River Capital in 2017. And if you were very careful, I'll go back one. You can notice that I say it wasn't a startup after 2017. And I think that's an important concept. Once you're owned by private equity instead of VC funders, it ceases to have a startup mentality. But when I joined, it did have a very good startup mentality. We were on Old Street Roundabout in London. That is Silicon Roundabout. So around us was 7 Digital, there was Just Eat down the road, there was Open Table, Top Table, all these companies. Yammer was there, Moo.com was up the road, TweetDeck had been there before. Our actual building was owned by Moo.com, then it was owned by TweetDeck before they got bought by Twitter, and then finally we were in it until it was knocked down. It was a really moldy old building. We always wondered why, although they said they were looking for new premises, we never seemed to move. And the answer was we paid no rent. We only paid a service charge, which VC funders love because VCs don't like long-term contracts and they don't like expenses like, paying for offices. So we actually were in that office, and towards the end, in the last month before we left, if a light bulb blew, they didn't replace them. So the corridors started to get quite dark in the shared spaces and things like that. It was a bit weird to be in there. And at that time, all the tech companies had branded gear. So we had Huddle hoodies. So that if you came to the office and you needed to pop out, you'd put on your Huddle hoodie, and everyone wandering around, there'd be people wandering around with Yammer, and then there'd be a 7 Digital crew, and then there was Huddle. Interestingly, in our last building that Huddle was in, we were on the same floor as Uber. Uber had the same thing. They had loads of Uber branded merchandise so that you could tell who was an Uber person. The interesting thing about telling that someone works at Uber is they're normally generally rude and quite obnoxious, because there's a corporate culture in Uber, and they really were quite rude and obnoxious people in general, and you didn't need to have an Uber hoodie to tell them apart. It's very weird. And the founders of the company loved word puns. So not only did we have summer and Christmas parties, we had Huddleween, and that was every Halloween. We rented a venue and we all got dressed up as zombies and dead people or something weird. We had a Thunderbirds party committee, so they actually had a social committee given a serious amount of money, £50,000 to £60,000 a year, in order to invest in Halloween and the summer and Christmas events and going go-karting and doing archery and all sorts of things that we could do. And similar to another startup, we did 3 buildings in 7 years. So I was at the first building in Silicon Roundabout for about a year and a bit. We then moved to a building in Aldgate that we actually moved into because it was cheap, and it was cheap because it was going to be demolished in the next 5 years. And while we were in that building, we saw a new office block rise opposite us across the street. And that event was owned by the same company as the building we were in. And we eventually moved to the exact building we'd saw being built, and then got to watch out of the windows of that building as the building we'd just been in was demolished bit by bit from the top because they couldn't blow it up with explosives. And we eventually got to see our floor on the second floor with beautiful blue columns, because obviously in a startup, you need to paint the columns in the color of your company. Benefits we had pensions and life insurance. This was the point at which Google had tried, and the big companies were now offering real benefits. So now you did get pensions and life assurance, you got proper maternity leave. Part of the reason there was proper maternity leave and paternity leave at Huddle is someone in HR left to have a baby and they created a maternity leave policy, which is very fortunate for everyone else who was about to have a baby. And we had something, another wordplay, we had a Huddle Cuddle, which was £500 after tax to spend every year. Which is a really cool thing to do for people because they might just buy a new laptop for home or a decent chair for the office, or I pay, spent it on a holiday for the family, things like that. And it was a nice kind of weird bonus that just appeared. And that's one of the things that kind of got removed when we went to private equity. And we got share options. And at the start, these were going to be life-changing share options and things like that. And they were. If we'd have become the unicorn, the £1 billion giant, if we'd have been bought by Microsoft, which at one point Microsoft were trying to buy Huddle to kind of be a kind of SharePoint thing, they bought Yammer, so it was not unreasonable that they'd buy another UK company like that. That would be really life-changing and pay off your house and all that kind of thing. So the crazy shit we had, well, not only did we have a cloud service, we actually provided an installable version of Huddle for the UK Home Office, kind of, secret service, to go in their data center. So it could take top secret documents. And the only access to the system was on a computer that was connected to a lease line. That lease line and the computer were all in a locked office. Once you got in the office, you had to know the combination to a safe. Once you opened the safe, you got a USB key. That allowed you to boot the laptop, which allowed you to connect to the home office. This all required you to have high-level clearance by the security services, and thank God I never got involved in that. Not because I've got a shady background, but I just do not want the agony of having to go through that process. That was really weird, and that safe had to be bolted to the floor. It wasn't capable. You had to prove that you could not move that safe physically. Which is quite weird. Our second building had meeting rooms that were all branded. So we had a phone box on one door, the red telephone box that you get in the UK. Then we had a blue telephone box. It was the TARDIS. Unlike the TARDIS, it was smaller on the inside than it looked from the outside because these were two-person meeting rooms. And if meetings were back-to-back, it was a bit humid by the end. And then we even had a Queen's Gardening on a locked room that actually was the one that now had the safe in it and a computer that could talk to the Home Office. And the other thing that was weird was, this is when I found out that the CIA has its own venture capital fund. So In-Q-Tel is the VC arm of the CIA. This is so American that the Secret Service has its own VC arm. And it invested in Huddle. And I heard from one of the tech ops that when they were doing the initial negotiations and they were showing the code, they wanted to get an installable version of Huddle and look at the source code. And our head of tech ops had to go to a cafe somewhere in Washington and deliver this source code almost in a brown paper bag under the table to a Secret Service operative. It was weird. But Huddle lost its startup mentality, and I loved the product. I loved the people I worked with. It was a great place to work. I worked with Ian Cooper. I worked with Toby Henderson. Bob Gregory was there. All these are guys who were in the startup scene in London. They were chatting at user groups. We invested in people. We invested in process that was useful. Teams had autonomy. And Ian Cooper spent 7-8 years making sure we went from a monolith to microservices in a good way, rather than a scattergun approach to microservices. And I learned a lot there. So my takeaways for all these startups that I worked in over these 19 years is definitely do not rely on share options, right? If you go to a company and they say, we want to retain you, we can't afford that, but how about we give you shares? My reaction now is give me something I can scratch a window with. I want to be paid real money. While we were at Huddle, there was loads of people who'd taken up the share options. When we got bought by our private equity firm, and it was publicized at the time, there was a drag clause. And because the VC funders weren't paid completely, anyone who bought share options, their shares were zeroed to no value. And whatever you'd paid for the share options, and some people had paid thousands of pounds, you got $100 back. That was all you got, which made a lot of people very unhappy. who left the company, and some people had actually bought share options while they were still at the company, and they were massively out of pocket. Our bonuses didn't always happen. People who'd been with the company for a few years who got regular bonuses started moaning about it, and I did point out they're not called expecteds, they're called bonuses, and if you don't get them, that's because we haven't earned enough as a company. And I always found that a bit of a shocking statement, but I don't understand why people thought bonuses could be relied upon. And as I said, startups are really cyclical between funding rounds. So you kind of get this sine curve of money, employ, lose money, not have enough money, sack people, then it all happens all over again. And requirements from big customers can really distort product roadmaps. So if you're a startup, you're dependent on your customers. If one customer is going to say, hey, if you do this, you can have hundreds of thousands of pounds in income, you are going to get your product skewed slightly, which may or may not suit all the rest of your customers. But they are fun. They are hard work. But I think you get to learn more. You're given more responsibility. You can be promoted faster than most big companies. You can negotiate better flexible working, especially if you do it when you join the company. It's much harder to do it once you're inside the company. But even then, some people change their hours, went from reduced hours or working from home. And it's much easier to do that at a startup. Big companies, BT, I've mentioned them before, they had an entire division devoted to enabling companies to have home workers, to enable people to work from home, to do video conferencing, to do remote data connections. And BT themselves told that home working division that none of them were allowed to work from home. It's unbelievable how these organizations that are huge act as if it would be so scary for people to work from home. The one thing we're getting from lockdown is some people are more productive when they work from home. It's become really obvious. Maybe you don't need as many people in the office. You do not need to keep seats warm in the office in order to be a productive company. This is a good thing. Also, I would check who already works at a startup. You might know people who have worked there, who come out with horror stories, you know, that's very real. That some of these places are quite scary to work at because they don't pay salaries properly and stuff like that. And you can get to work with great people. So there will be people who you might have heard of, and you can go and work with them. The interesting bit is one of the commercial support people at Huddle said he came to Huddle because there were Microsoft MVPs there working. There was me there, there was Ian Cooper, and he said it's really good because you've got these technical experts. And then he went to another company that had Docker captains, and they were going to be experts. And then after he worked there for 9 months, he said, we were in the pub, and he said, you know what? When I keep going to these companies and they've got these real product experts, it's because the company's in shit and they need product experts to dig them out of it. And he said, it's okay for you guys because working with these guys is really good fun and it's really good to work with these experts. But if you're in sales, it's a red flag to see all these really good people at a company because it probably means they're struggling. But yeah, startups are also better at adopting new frameworks and practices. They're more on the curve. You've got more chance of learning new stuff, and it's just really good fun. And of course, crazy shit happens more often than you'd think. And that's actually fun as well, because at the end, it allows you to come and give a talk like this, or go down the pub and discuss war stories that are just hilarious. And you wouldn't believe the stuff I've edited out of this presentation that I wouldn't be allowed to say. So yes, so now I moved on from Huddle in November last year. I came to a fintech called Free Market. I'd finally taken money from the finance side of the business and the world, but it is a startup. Over half the people have only been there a year. We've got really nice funding. We haven't furloughed anyone. We're nearly profitable, which is good news for us. We're not burning cash in some sine wave of funding, which is an important thing that I talked to the guys about when I was talking to them about joining. Because I'd learned those lessons that I don't want to be in a company that's going to be kind of making people upset every 6 to 9 months. Maybe next year, maybe in a few years, there'll be a tale of 5 startups, and I'll include Free Market FX in there. But I want to keep my job at the moment, so I don't think I'm going to actually talk about it much at the moment. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the talk. We're only 1 minute over. If anyone's got any questions, I'll put a message in here. Right. And I'm going to set up a thread on that. There we are. And that allows you to click on the one reply if you're not used to Slack, and you'll be able to just talk in a separate thread so we don't fill the conference suite with loads of messages about startups, and the next speaker can have a nice clean Slack channel to talk in. Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed that, and I hope I'll be seeing you in person in NDC Oslo next year, maybe in NDC London, maybe that will be in person. But I will be hanging around the conference for 3 days. I will hang around the hallway track. You can direct message me if you want to just chat to me. If you want to kind of pretend we're in a conference where we just bumped in the corridor, let's go to the hallway track and have a chat and get other people involved. It'll be really good fun because I like that conference vibe and I'm going to miss that side of the conference. Thank you very much.